Welcome back to the Swamp 24/7 podcast. I'm Thomas Goldkamp here with my co-host Blake Alderman. Blake, I know it's been quite a bit since we've had an episode of the podcast. I know that you've been in the middle of a move. I see some nice fancy appliances in the background now.
That's literally the only thing in here. Everything else is pretty empty after redoing the floor.
Hey, that's okay, man. I know it's
I'm
always fun
thugging it out here in the kitchen.
Awesome. And I've had some stuff going on, so we apologize for not having an episode recently. But Blake, let's get back into it. I think the last time we talked on the podcast, Florida was kind of in the middle of finalizing its 2022 recruiting class with National Signing Day and all that. The Gators ended up moving up all the way up to number 16 nationally. And I know that, when Billy Napier took over, obviously, there was a decent class in place, obviously below Florida standards, I think, when Dan Mullen left. Billy Napier took a very deliberate approach to sort of making sure that they got the guys that they wanted. Contact, with some of the commits that they had varied in certain instances. But Blake, I wanted to ask you, what was your overall impression of, not just the early signing period, which we've talked about previously on the podcast, but really the entire close to the 2022 class, where they ended up? What was your takeaway from this kind of sort of transition recruiting class for Billy Napier?
I think if you look at the class as a whole and you see where they started from, I think it was somewhere in the low 70s, somewhere in that ballpark. Mm-hmm. And you see the rise up to 16. I think you get an idea of what Napier and his coaching staff can do on the recruiting front. But I think there are also some differences there because obviously the early signing period went really well for Florida. You get guys like, Kamari Wilson, Shamar James, all the guys that they were able to land in that early signing period. And I think that gives you a better idea. I think that if you're a fan of recruiting in a Florida football, that's more what you zero in on, because when you get past the early signing period and you have a coach that's hired so late as what Napier does, there's really not a lot of time in that early signing period. So you saw what those guys were able to do in a crunch of guys, that they came in late on that they were able to snag. But then whenever you turn over things into the traditional National Signing Day in February, there really just isn't a lot of top tier guys left out there. Not all, right. Sure, there are plenty of guys out there that are, big time targets, but Florida really had to kind of work with what they had, from a target standpoint. So some of those guys they landed, I think they hit on a lot of, areas they wanted to, hit on. Obviously you land a quarterback, you get some playmakers there on the offensive side of the ball, on the defensive side of the ball. You go in there through the transfer portal and you add some guys that you really feel that you have, that they can come in and make an instant impact. You get some younger guys in there like a Montrell Johnson, who's coming from UL Lafayette. You get Jaylen Kimber from Georgia, who's another young guy at that defensive back position that really kind of helped bring some more talent there. And a guy like Osiris Torrance, someone that we're both really excited about, and someone who's probably a one-year rental type of player because he was already getting quite a bit of draft buzz. So I think you get a guy like that can really help your offensive line, can really help, an area where Florida need to shore up on that interior part of their offensive line. I think when it comes to signing day, I do think it was a bit of a letdown, but I also think at the same time, you go back to just the fact that you're kind of scrambling for things, you're kind of putting things together there at the last minute. I don't think that the traditional signing day is one where you really need to hang your hat on if you follow recruiting, because again, a lot of those big time guys sign in the December signing period. So I think we'll get a better idea of how the staff is recruiting in the 2023 cycle, where they have a full cycle to recruit guys, build those relationships, get guys on campus, and you're not so rushed to try to, build these bonds, get guys on campus in flurries, having all these guys in on official visit weekends in a January, which is very untraditional from what I've covered, just in that scan of time. Usually it's, maybe one or two guys that you're having in a couple weekends there that you can really, put the full court press on. But Florida's having to bring guys in droves on those official visit weekends. So I think whenever you look at the signing day, it was a letdown in the sense of, you have a guy like Trevante Citizen who went to Miami, a guy that there was a lot of Florida buzz there in the late part of it. Adding a guy like Caleb Douglas at the wide receiver position, which was one of the big question marks because, again, not a lot of guys left on the board. You go out and, that's your first offer. That's the guy that you build relationships with. And I think that there's a lot to like about his game. Obviously, another guy like Arlis Boardingham, who signed with Florida about a week after that National Signing Day. He's kind of the guy that's in more of the Kyle Pitts type of role as a tight end. You can do different things with him. He's more of a traditional receiving type of tight end. Someone that I think that you can do a lot of different things with. So I think when you look at the names that Florida had, the Jacoby Matthews, plenty of guys out there that were big time targets for Florida, but maybe didn't have the time to get a full cycle in there. There was a letdown whenever you see a lot of those guys, especially Trevante Citizen, a guy that I had a 24/7 crystal ball on for Florida, go to Miami. So I think that I'm really interested to see where these guys go in the 2023 cycle. They're getting guys on campus. They'll have a lot of guys on campus in March, in the parts of April into the spring game. So I think that this is the cycle where we really see where these guys, where they get after it on the recruiting trail, because it's going to be their first full cycle.
Yeah, and I think there's going to be a lot of interesting differences between the 2022 recruiting class and the 2023 class, not just in the sense that Florida's staff will have sort of the full recruiting window. And I say full, I mean, typically you start recruiting a lot of these kids, the superstars, the guys that end up being the 5-stars, you're recruiting a lot of those guys as high school freshmen, right? So it's 2023 is not going to be the peak of this staff's recruiting ability, I don't think. But you are able to sell your vision in a way that you can do in the transition class, but you just don't have as much time to let that kind of sink in. And I think when you talk about quote unquote, signing day being a little bit of a disappointment, I think you're talking about looking at, the list. Yeah, the list of guys that Florida went in with, where they were at least in the hunt for, like a Trevante Citizen, like Harold Perkins even. And I think if you look at a guy like Harold Perkins, who was, a 5-star linebacker committed to Texas A&M, you look at the class that Texas A&M put together, for Florida to even have been in that battle and have gotten him to, basically decommit from Texas A&M and was in the picture for him. I think that shows you sort of what Billy Napier and his staff will eventually be capable of. And they didn't finish that one, and they didn't finish with Trevante Citizen. I think, for the actual day of signing day, that created maybe a little bit of a negative impression. But again, I go back to, like you said, since the early signing period has become a thing, it's sort of shifted up the real national signing day. Like, to me, the early signing period is now at the real national signing day. Like, something like 75% to 80% of the guys sign there. And if you go back to the early signing period, Billy Napier and his staff did really well. The other thing, Blake, that I really like about this class is I think you've got a good mix of class balance in there. And we've talked about that. Defensive tackle was kind of one of the issues that Dan Mullen ran into, where they were out of whack class balance. Offensive line, for really going back to 2010, honestly. And Bill Sykes, a guy that has, been part of that Gators Breakdown podcast crew over the years here and there, and has contributed to Read and Reaction. He did an excellent piece on the O-line and sort of the just gyrations that they've gone through in terms of recruiting numbers at that position. I think Billy Napier, as far as you can, for a transition class, did a very good job of not overreacting to certain spots of need, such that you're going to have, a huge glut of guys in one or two classes, and then all of a sudden, like, you get to a year where you can only take one safety or one offensive lineman, and unexpected attrition can really sink you. So I like the class balance that Florida had. The other thing I really like is, like you said, those transfers that they brought in. You're talking about Osiris Torrance, day one starter on the offensive line, a spot that Florida had to get better. Jaylen Kimber is a guy that at cornerback for Georgia, before he had a shoulder injury in fall camp and that kind of lingered into the season, he was a guy that the national championship Georgia Bulldogs were really expecting to be a starter. So obviously a very high-level player. I know that coming out of high school, he was a 4-star prospect, I think like a borderline top 100, top 150 guy. Montrell Johnson's a guy that you look at Florida's running back room with Naquan Wright coming off of a major foot injury against FSU. Damian Pierce and Malik Davis are in Indianapolis this week. At least Damian Pierce is. Malik Davis is not at the combine. But those are two guys that are off to the NFL. You've got some holes to replace. Montrell Johnson's a guy that can immediately step on campus this spring and start to bring up some of the younger guys. He knows Billy Napier's system. So I think you got a good mix of guys that can contribute right away and guys that can, like you said, sort of emerge as those prospects, like an Arliss Boardingham down the road as a receiving type tight end. The other thing I thought that was interesting, Blake, and I want to get your thoughts on this, Florida only signed, out of the 18 guys that they signed, only 6 from the state of Florida. And I have kind of a twofold take on that. One, that can't be the case going forward. I think Florida has to do better in the state of Florida. And I think if you listen to Billy Napier and his staff, they know that, right? But the thing that's interesting to me is even in a transition class, Billy Napier was able to get guys from Washington, like defensive lineman Andrew Savanea. He was able to get guys, Arliss Boardingham, I believe, from, where's he at on the West Coast? Blake, help me out. California. You got you know, Max Brown's from Tulsa, Oklahoma. You've got Christian Williams from Missouri City, Texas. I mean, you've got guys from really all across the country in this class. And I think that to me indicates some level of, if you're getting guys to move all the way over from the West Coast to come to Florida, yeah, that happens here and there. But when you have multiple of those types of guys in one class, you're selling something right. So I'm curious to get your take on, do you expect that sort of national recruiting to continue? If so, how does it evolve? And then how do you see this staff sort of constructing not just the 2023 class, but like what's kind of their blueprint for a recruiting class in terms of in the state versus out of the state going forward?
I think that going forward, the focus is going to be on in-state. You look at a lot of the guys that are coming on to campus in those spring months. A lot of those guys are from the state of Florida. I think that's where you're going to really see them try to put their fingerprint. I think that the surrounding areas, the state of Georgia, the Carolinas, parts of, all those surrounding states close to Florida, I think is where you're going to start to see them try to make that more of their bread and butter. I think that, again, you go back to the early signing period where a lot of those guys in the state of Florida had already signed. You turn things over to, sign what you can in December, try to do the best you can there. And then you turn over to what's left in, the months of January and into February. And there's really not that many guys left, in the state of Florida that are, guys that, can come in and make a contribution. Guys that, like you said, there won't be any attrition later as you continue to recruit and get some of those guys that, maybe are more of the Florida standard type of guys. So I think that the focus going forward are going to be those surrounding areas. I do think there will be some national recruiting mixed in there because I think that, when you're a school like Florida and the way that recruiting has gone now, when you're in the SEC, if you start winning some of those games, I mean, look at Alabama, they're recruiting at a national level. State Georgia's recruiting at a national level. Clemson, all those schools that are the blue blood type of schools that are, as far as recruiting goes, they're recruiting at a national level. I think that you do need to take care of your areas where you have ties. Obviously there's guys at Florida that have ties to the state of Texas. They've had some success there. Jay Bateman's coming from Florida's inside linebackers coach is coming from North Carolina, where he's got some ties to that state as well. Napier's got ties to the state of Tennessee, state of Georgia. Kerry Colbert, Florida's wide receivers coach. I think that you need to draw a fine line of recruiting the state of California because it's not easy to get a lot of those guys to come in droves or even consistently from California to Florida. But I think, again, those are areas where you've got connections, people, coaches, trainers, all the 9 yards that go with, with people that have connections to these recruits. So I do think that they're going to really try to capitalize on those states where they have connections at, but I think in general that the blueprint, fingerprint part of Florida's recruiting is going to have to be the state of Florida. That's where the big dogs come in. A lot of the schools that are, that are those blue blood type of recruiting schools, they're coming to the state of Florida and they're taking those players out of state. So I think that that's the area where Napier's going to put his focus. You see him going with some of the staff members to the Florida high school coaches, where they meet, have all the high school coaches there. You're seeing him do, speaking tours like at Lakeland High School, where, a school that has sent a lot of guys to Florida. He's got connections, to some of these coaches that are in the state of Florida. He's working his tail off to build these connections that he doesn't already have and to try to capitalize on the connections already made. So I think the state of Florida it's not only is it imperative for him to recruit the state going forward, but I absolutely think that that's going to be the focus for him and his staff.
Yeah, and I think they're saying all the right things there. Again, proof is always in the pudding, but I do like that the staff is constructed in such a way. And when I say staff, like we used to kind of visualize that as really just being the 10 assistants, right? Billy Napier has a staff where, and I think not just a staff, but a process where those off the field staffers are involved in the process to a large degree, maybe like we haven't seen at Florida in the past. And Billy Napier has very much constructed a staff that sort of has ties everywhere, right? And so if you do have a kid that's a 4 or 5 star prospect from California that for whatever reason you may have an in with, and Urban Meyer was incredibly good at this. He would figure out, if there's a Ronald Powell out in USC, is there some level of interest in there? Is there a connection to a Ronald Powell, a Percy Harvin up in the DMV area? Like, and they would work on that. And Billy Napier has enough guys from different spots in the country, maybe not all on the assistant coaching staff, but in those support staff roles where they have a lot of ins. And I know you mentioned Lakeland High School where he went and did the speaking tour last night. I want to talk to you about that after the break as we talk a little bit about 2023 recruiting. But Lakeland just hired Ahmad Black to coach defensive backs there. It's a really good thing for Florida. And I think you're starting to see sort of it's almost like a tree, right? And Billy Napier was sort of the trunk, and as they get the main branches, the assistants, some of these guys have ties to some of these off the field staffers, and you're seeing this very big network start to emerge for Florida recruiting. But I think you're absolutely right. I think the state has to become a priority. So Blake, let's take a quick break, and when we come back on the other side, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the month of March because it's going to be a big one for laying the foundation for this 2023 class. And then I want to get your thoughts some on having had the chance to hear Billy Napier speak last night at the Lakeland football gathering. So let's take a quick break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Swamp 24/7 podcast. I'm Thomas Goldkamp here with Blake Alderman. Blake, I don't want to get too into specifics on 2023 recruits by name yet. We can talk about Florida's interest in a guy like Arch Manning, who, obviously everybody kind of knows the Manning family and all that.
Name sounds familiar.
Yeah, I mean, the five-star types, if you want to throw some names in there, that's cool. But for now, I want you to kind of give us a bigger picture outlook of what the month of March looks like, what, early April looks like for Florida. Florida obviously starting spring football on March 15th, so that'll be part of it. You'll be able to have recruits out there at some of these practices, some of these weekends where Florida's practicing. But what is the general outlook? What are casual football fans, casual Florida fans, that want to get into recruiting a little bit more? What are they looking for in this month of March? Month of March. There you go.
I think that in general, when you look at the month of March as a whole, there's guys coming in droves. I mean, even the days that they've had so far, from the first to the second to the third, they've had kids on campus and not just one guy that's in there. They've had a couple guys on campus. Some days are more busy than others. Like on March 3rd, they have more guys from, city of Jacksonville, guys from Central Florida coming in. But when you really look at the visitor list, which is on Swamp 24/7, I've got all the days that are on there. The weekends they're fantastic. You look at the weekends, the weekend of March 5th, full of, plenty of 5-star type of players. Just to throw out some of the 5-stars, you've got a 5-star edge rusher in Keon Keeley. Grew up a fan of the Florida Gators, goes to Tampa Berkeley Prep, he's committed to Notre Dame, but he's still taking some visits. Obviously a bit forward this weekend. He's been in Alabama before. Francis Mauigoa, a 5-star offensive lineman from IMG Academy, who's from out west. 5-star athlete Samuel Mpemba, a guy that is probably more of an edge rusher type of outside linebacker type of guy, but he is listed as an athlete, has played tight end before, but I think his future and his more focus is playing on the defensive side of the ball. But I mean, even this weekend, you've got plenty of top 247 guys, high 4-star types of players, guys that can really make an immediate impact from the state of Florida that are going to be coming to campus this weekend. Some guys in the state of Georgia that'll be coming in there. So, you even go into the other parts of the week, obviously Florida's going to have guys coming in and out. But that weekend or that Saturday of March 5th is really solid. They have other guys going in through the week. That week of the 6th through the 12th, Florida's actually having their spring break. So they're not going to have many kids in there. I haven't had any guys that have told me. And if they have, they've rescheduled their visits for that week. So I think that's where you see a little bit of a lull there, but it cranks right back up, that week following and guys coming in there. Another really impressive weekend for Florida is that weekend of March 18th. That is the one where you've got a 5-star quarterback in Dante Moore. You've got plenty of, again, high 4-star types of players. But March 19th, I mean, that's the day where I've circled, you've got 3 5-star players at the same cornerback position. That's the Corey Raymond effect for Florida. 5-star cornerback AJ Harris, 5-star cornerback Colmani McClain, and 5-star cornerback Tony Mitchell. All 3 of those guys are going to be there for multi-day visits on the 19th and the 20th. So that's a chance to really make a splash to that defensive back position. Even going into the rest of the month. I mean, I know we wanted to make this fairly quick, and I could honestly sit there and go on for the entirety of this show for all the guys that are coming in there. That's how loaded the visitor list for the entire month of March is for Florida. I mean, it's very impressive. And again, we go back to what we were talking about before, where the focus being on the state of Florida. I'd say 85% of these guys on this visitor list are from the state of Florida. So again, putting a big focus on the state of Florida, getting those guys to come in either for their second visit if they were able to make it there in January to spend time with the coaching staff and build off of that, or they're getting their first chance to spend time with the coaching staff to build those bonds and try to continue to let this thing grow, get them back on campus, secure an official visit down the road. However long these guys want to take out the recruitment, this is where it starts, by getting them on campus, continuing to build those relationships, or starting them on campus.
Yeah, I think when you talk about the number of players from the state of Florida and trying to increase not just the percentage of guys that Florida is landing, at least relative to the transition class from the state, but the caliber of the players from the state of Florida, where you're not allowing quite as many of those 5-star types, the Amari Coopers, the DeMarcus Bowmans who initially went to Clemson, not allowing quite as many Trey Sanders, not allowing quite as many of those is going to be a big focus for Florida. And I listened to Billy Napier on a radio interview, and I can't remember the name of the program that he was on at this point, but I wrote about it on Swamp 24/7. He's done his research. He said, he's gone back through the national championship rosters at Florida. And when he looked at it, now I tried to look it up earlier and had some audio go off, so I didn't want to ruin the podcast. But it's something like 80 to 85% of the roster was made up of players from the state of Florida when the Gators were really good. And I think on top of just the recruiting angle of trying to get more of those elite 4 and 5-star types, there's a lot of people in the state, a lot of good high school players in the state of Florida that maybe don't get quite the D1 offer that they want. They're going to be really good. And when you talk about this 50-person walk-on program, you can build a pretty quality walk-on roster from guys that are D1 prospects that maybe don't necessarily want to go to like a smaller D1 school. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that's a big part of it. But Blake, is there anything as far as results from sort of the month of March, month of April that fans should be looking for? Because the casual fan always wants to know who's going to commit next, right? And I'm not asking you to put anybody on commitment watch, but will there be any level of concern if we kind of get through the month of March and Florida doesn't have a couple decent 4-star type prospects jump aboard?
I always feel like the time to really hit the panic button is near the end of the summer, whenever you see a lot of those guys that want to get their decision out of the way before the fall season starts, fall camp, all those types of things. I feel like that's always the determining timeline for me to see, because by then you should have your nucleus of your class. You should have not everybody in the class, but you should have that solid foundation of guys, because not all those guys want to be done. But it's turning into more and more of a common theme for these guys getting their decisions done, taking their official visits in the month of April, into June, maybe making a decision sometime in the summer, if not before the fall season starts up. So that to me is always where I put in the big focus of things. I think with a new coaching staff, sure, you would expect to see some commitments for Florida. You would like to see some commitments for Florida coming in there out of those visits in the month of March into April, whether you get a guy come back for the spring game and make a decision there. But I think the big part of this is, it's hard to really pinpoint that, because let's say a guy visits on March 26th, but that's his first visit he's ever gone to Florida.
Right.
Ever met the coaching staff, has talked to them, likes them, but has never met them in person, has gotten that vibe. So I think a lot of those guys that are maybe making return trips, I think that maybe those are the guys to keep an eye on as far as, a guy who could or couldn't make a decision. But some of these guys really, you look at recruiting now, guys like to take visits. They like the attention. They like to go out and be wowed. They like to take official visits. They want to take official visits to get, the red carpet rolled out for them. So I think a lot of guys that, yes, they're really good players and they like the game of football, but they also like to be recruiting. Who doesn't like to be courted like that? So
of course,
I think that, again, there are going to be some guys that, you would at least expect to have some kind of decision in the spring. If you go in and you're blown away by Florida, you're blown away by the staff. You've got a guy like Corey Raymond who has, the repertoire that he does and the pedigree of a name that he has. So I think you would like to see some of those guys in the spring make a decision. But I think, again, the later part of the summer or into the summer is where I think you really need to start hitting that panic button. If you don't have that nucleus of guys, that really makes you say, like, okay, this is what we're working with. Let's attack this into the fall with official visits, game visits, leading up to signing day.
And that's exactly the reason I asked, Blake, because I know when people see these loaded visitor lists, they're going to get really excited. And then for the people, that aren't used to maybe sort of the timeline of the whole process, it can be frustrating to come out of these visits, to hear a lot of good things. But then, I go back to that first June official visit weekend that Dan Mullen and his staff had, where they had 5-star guys like Walter Nolan and, some of these other really top-notch prospects on. Well, it was the first recruiting weekend, right? So I think what you're looking for in this March period is, like you said, establishing those roots, those connections with the guys who maybe are meeting the staff for the first time. And then you want to see staying power in those recruitments, right? You want to see not just the buzz coming out of those visits, but you want to see it sustained throughout the summer, as in to the point where, they go on a visit to Florida and then maybe they go to Auburn or they go to Clemson or they go to Georgia, and they're still talking about Florida after all those visits, right? That's what you need to see from Florida in this period here. Don't be too disappointed if there's not a ton of commitments directly out of the spring. We'll probably get a couple. I think usually that happens. But to Blake's point, a lot of these guys like to wait until a little closer to the summer. Some of them will want to get their commitments out of the way before their senior season starts. But a lot of these guys, if Florida's recruiting the way it should be, are going to be guys that announce on the early signing day on ESPN, ESPN2, CBS Sports HQ, these kind of things. Because, like Blake said, it's fun to get recruited. It's fun to have the spotlight. But Blake, I think real quickly here, and we can wrap up. I wanted to get your thoughts on what you heard from Billy Napier at Lakeland, and just generally speaking, not necessarily even recruiting related, but just where you're at on sort of the message that he's conveying right now in his first 3 months at Florida.
I think that, where he was at, it was Lakeland High School's end of the year football banquet. So you come in and it wasn't like where we have a bunch of bull gators in a room and, you're trying to, really kind of talk up the fan base. But I think that I've gone to a couple of these before. I've seen Jim McElwain speak at these. I've seen Dan Mullen speak at these. I've seen Dabo, speak at these. There's been a lot of coaches that have come and they've spoke at these kind of things. And I thought that from, following the Gator gatherings and all those types of things, you start to hear the same speech over and over and over and over and over again. It's almost like a cookie cutter
boring,
type
believe
of
it or
speech.
not.
But I don't think that Napier's, we'll see whenever you start to get more into the speaking tour season, if a lot of these same, conversations come up. But to me, it was something, there were some similarities in, radio hits, TV hits, things that Napier have done that he's brought up before. But I think overall the speech was really like he like wrote it for its own for this banquet for Lakeland. He comes in, he talks about the 400 plus wins that Bill Castle, Lakeland's head coach, has had. Congratulated him on that. Said that for him that coming to these types of speaking tours, it's easy to come up whenever you've got a 0-0 record like he does at Florida. But it's hard, whenever he aims to be a guy like Bill Castle, to be able to come up and not have to, be scared to show his face because he didn't have a good season, because he, complimented just the sustainability that he's had at that state championships he's won at Lakeland. And I think one of the coolest talking points he had was that he talked about his dad, who had passed away. I believe he said in 2017 for ALS. He had Lou Gehrig's disease. He really kind of got
very well respected high school coach.
Right. He really got, kind of personal with his speech. And he said that, his dad dropping him and his brothers, his family members off at school, always asked them, it was like, as soon as you get out of the car, going to school, dad asked, what's your name? And that, he said that it's something that's always stuck with him, is that, he always replied what his name was. And his dad always said, represent it, represent that name, make sure you do the right things. And he said that that's something that's carried over him, through his coaching career. He said that he had represent on the wall at ULL. He said that'll be on the wall at Florida. And he said that that's something he always asks his players, what's your name? Represent it. He said to make sure you're doing the right things on and off the field. He urged a lot of these high school guys, to come back with the unfinished business and, continue to make a state run for Lakeland. And if they're going to the college level, to continue to represent themselves. So I think that was kind of where the core of his speech was just being able to represent yourself, do the right thing for your high school or your college. He complimented a lot of the guys that have come from Lakeland. He named a lot of the guys, the Finley Grahams, the Marcus Bowmans, Keon Zipper, Lloyd Summerall, all those guys that are on the Lakeland roster right now. Complimented a lot of those guys, said they need to continue to get more of those guys. Said that he knows Polk County is kind of really Florida friendly. The county in general has been good to Florida. He said he wants to continue that going. And even after that, Ahmad Black was named the defensive back coach that like you said, at Lakeland High School. And he's got another guy at Lake Gibson, the head coach there, Keith Bearfield, who was a former analyst under him at ULL. So he's got those ties in that area. And the speech in general, like I said, it just wasn't like a cookie cutter type of speech. It seemed like, it was really personal from the heart. And I mean, he went on with a lot of other things, talking about, making sure to keep your focus, staying, with all the things that high school football players need to do. But his main points again, the talking point about representing your name was one that really stuck with me. And just the fact that he wants to continue that Lakeland pipeline. He knows that school has been good to them and he wants to keep that going.
Yeah, I think that's important. And I think we've heard sort of a personalized approach from Billy Napier in a lot of different areas since he took over at Florida. I think that will pay dividends. And again, I think it's easier to have that personalized approach when you have a staff that has sort of these ties to everywhere, and you can personalize it a little bit more because you can talk to a guy that is from that area or knows that area really well. And I think Billy Napier has done a very good job of incorporating former players. I know that he's made guys like Ahmad Black feel very welcome within the Florida program. I think that's going to continue to be a goal going forward to really use every bit of the massive network that the University of Florida has. I know he talks about the 450,000 plus alumni and sort of tapping into all the tremendous resources that Florida has. And I think it's terrific. So, Blake, I want to wrap the podcast there. Florida will start spring practice on March 15th. So we're less than 2 weeks away from that. We actually have some really exciting news on Swamp 24/7 as well. In addition to Blake and I, Swamp 24/7 has now hired another full-time writer, Jacob Rudner. He's coming over to us from the West Coast, has experience covering Arizona State, is going to get his feet wet in the SEC, and it's going to be fun to watch. But he is a very, very hungry writer. Excellent content so far on the site. Just in the first week, I've gotten numerous subscribers reach out to me via private message, basically saying this dude's killing it so far. So if you haven't checked out Swamp 24/7, if you haven't seen Jacob's work, be sure to check that out. The other thing is we're going to be back to a more regular schedule here through spring ball. We'll probably be shooting about 2 episodes per week. And at some point, once Jacob kind of gets his feet wet, he's in the middle of moving to Gainesville right now. We'll get him on the podcast as well because he's going to be out at spring practice with me. He'll be actually in Gainesville. So finally, we'll have a second person in Gainesville that will help me a little bit. It'll help round out our coverage a little bit. But Blake, I think, barring movers, floors being done, stuff like that, I think we'll try to shoot on Monday with sort of a general spring preview. And then I think leading into spring practice, we'll do another episode or 2, maybe breaking down specific position battles, that kind of thing. Be on the lookout with this channel. If you're watching on YouTube, may shift. I know we're talking to 24/7 corporate about some different structuring there. So we will communicate that if that happens. But the podcast you will always be able to find on audio on your normal iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Podbean, Player FM, and Google Podcasts. So if you're listening audio only, you won't have any issues. If you're listening on video, just be aware that we may communicate. There may be a channel shift a little bit, sort of a rebranding shift. So just be aware of that. But guys, thank you for tuning in. I know that it's been a while since our last podcast. We appreciate you guys being patient with us, and we hope to be back on Monday with a beginning of a spring football preview. So thank you for tuning in.